and welcome to Next Gen Finance, an SEB podcast about sustainable finance. My name is Lina Apsheva, I'm your host, and today we're going to focus on the topic that, without exaggeration, touches everyone who lives on this planet, and that topic is water. We will explore the challenges that exist in this area and perhaps more importantly, the opportunities that are out there and also how finance can play a role. To discuss this topic, I have invited two of my colleagues. First, I will talk to Åsa Knudsen Sterte, a senior advisor in climate and sustainable finance, who also leads the water workstream, no pun intended, in our team. We will talk about her recent experience in New York at the UN Water Conference and, in general, what her expectations and view is on this topic. After that, I will talk to Jessica Mattsson, who the long-term listeners of our podcast should be familiar with, who's been on the podcast before, and she will tell us about the research project that she has been involved in recently, also dealing with water and specifically water-related equity. So a lot of exciting conversations waiting for us today, and first I'm happy to welcome Åsa Knudsen Sterte. Åsa, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today and coming to talk to us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Since it's your first time on the podcast, I was wondering if you could maybe start by introducing yourself a little bit and what your role in our team is. I assume that a lot of our listeners will be very curious about what a lead in the water work stream does.
Yes, I started here at SEB for a bit more than 2 years ago, and my background is a bit from the regulatory side because I worked at the Ministry of Finance before I came here with regulations concerning sustainable finance. But since a bit more than a year ago, I started to dig into the challenge of water a little bit more. And that relates to everything about access to drinking water, to how to face the challenges with this aging infrastructure that we have just outside our own doors. So it's a broad topic, and I hope to get into it a bit more as we speak.
Yes, certainly there are a lot of challenges when it comes to water, and we'll definitely get into them in a little bit more detail. But first, I wanted to ask you, you've just come back about a week ago, right, from New York, from the UN Water Conference. Could you tell us what the conference was about and why it's so important, why everyone was talking about it just 2 weeks ago?
The UN Water Conference took place between the 22nd and 24th of March. This was the first of its kind in almost 50 years. We expected it to be this Paris moment for water as it was for climate. And even if we did not reach all the way, I think it was a lot of interest from governments, from academics, from the private sector. And one of the main outcomes of the conference was going to be this water action agenda, where stakeholders were going to commit to certain actions related to water. And in the end, we had about 700 commitments. And it was everything from hard numbers on investments to promises about cooperations among different stakeholders. And we have had some critiques against the lack of hard numbers, but I think at least we got some interest and some headlight on the importance of water as a topic.
Very interesting. And when you say Paris moment, you mean, of course, the Paris Agreement that kind of kick-started this theme of climate change and it being introduced into all areas of life, right? So it's interesting to see if that's something that's going to happen with water now. But we will get back to, the expectations for the future a bit later. First, I would like to go back to this topic of challenges, right? You named a few examples, like access to drinking water, for example. But when it comes to challenges in the area of water, when we say that, what exactly do we mean? What is out there and what is it that we need to address?
Relating to what you say about climate change, you can say that climate change is perhaps the root of some of the changes we see in nature today, but the water is actually showing the effects. So we have drought, we have flooding, we have changes in rain patterns. And as of today, almost 25% of the world's population lacks access to drinking water. And about 45% of the world's population lacks access to sanitation services. So up until 2030, we do expect to have, if we don't change the consumption and production that we have today, we expect to have about 700 million people that is called water refugees that needs to move because they lack this access to water. So it's really a serious topic and a challenge that we need to address.
Would you say then that the focus in the conference was more on this kind of human-centric water issues, or is it also including, for example, life underwater, right? Or, the listeners of our podcast will know that I'm very passionate about biodiversity, so I'm immediately thinking, what about all the different fish species that live in water that are also suffering from different challenges? So I'm just trying to understand where is the focus and the spotlight here.
We actually had a quite large conference not too long ago that was focusing on lives in the ocean. This conference was more related to access to sanitation and drinking water, but a lot of preservation of the fresh water that we have is highly related to biodiversity, because if we don't take care about the biodiversity, we also lose a lot of natural purifications. And that's the thing about water, because you can't really discuss water, because water comes into biodiversity, it comes into transnational, it's the rain, it's the pipes, so it's a very broad topic.
It makes up majority of the cover of our planet, right? It's kind of, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that it's literally woven through every area of our life and we can't separate one from another. But very interesting. And I know that there are quite a few people here in SEB, in addition to you, who are focusing on this topic and who find this topic incredibly important and interesting. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how SEB as a bank engages with this theme of water.
Since 1.5 years ago, we have started to look into different work streams relating to water. So one work stream is how to address the challenge of outdated infrastructure. We have that in Sweden. We have underinvestments in this aging infrastructure. We have the same challenge all over Europe. So that's one part where we're looking into. We're also looking into how water-related risk factors affect our clients' portfolios. Because if you are a brewer company, for example, you're highly dependent on access to clean water. So if you don't have that, how can you maintain your operations? That's a huge risk factor. And that's something we see also more and more, that we see the awareness that the water-related risks are translated into financial risks and the actual operations of the companies. So that's another work stream.
And no wonder that there are so many different opportunities when it comes to finance and water, and merging the two themes together when it comes to developing new instruments, for example. I think one really cool example is blue bonds, which is an equivalent of green bonds, but in the case of blue bonds, then the proceeds are used specifically for water-related challenges, whether it is building new infrastructure or addressing biodiversity challenges in water, which I think is a great example of how we can use these type of instruments like bonds that has been around for ages, but then tweaking them to add that new component of creating positive impact, right? And when it comes to blue bonds, it's of course positive impact specifically on water. But what do you think, Åsa? Is there anything else when it comes to the finance space that we should keep in mind when it comes to the water theme?
Well, what we know is that there is this huge investment needs, and as of today, the most money spent on water-related themes are from the public sector, and that will not be sufficient going forward. So some areas that we see looking forward is to increase investment into freshwater storage systems, And here, relating to your question about biodiversity previously, we have this commitment on biological diversity from COP15 to protect 30% of terrestrial inland waters and coastal and marine areas by 2030. Some of you may recognize it as this 30 by 30. We also need to use technology much better to monitor the groundwater. And here we see also that we need to expand the water infrastructure in the developing world, where so many people still lack a tap to take water that we take for granted. We also see that this aging infrastructure that we have in Europe and all over the world cause a lot of leakages. And that's a really waste of water to just let it drop out from the pipes. So here we need to renovate the pipes and come up with the new pipe materials and some instruments so we can detect and fix those leaks. Because in Sweden, for example, the average leakage is about 20%, and in some parts of Europe it's even more. And that's a waste of water, but it's also a waste of energy for purifying that water. And then we also need to use water in industry much more efficient. So we see in some areas in the world where you have shortage and you are used to have shortage of water, you have much more advanced recycling techniques than we have perhaps in Sweden, where we are used to have this tap water running. So we need to learn from each other and to develop innovation in a much better way.
Yeah, and I think if I may just point out what you mentioned there, a very interesting thing about people in developing countries lacking access to water, and while at the same time we, for example, in Sweden or in Europe, might take it for granted to the extent that we don't even realize the leakages and the waste that is occurring. But I think that kind of highlights also the social aspect, right, of water, because if people in some countries where especially women, right? Even the gender aspect comes in, because if women and girls need to spend hours and hours every day just going to the water well and bringing the clean water to the household, that's the time that they can spend on their education, for example, going to school. They have to commit instead to this water labor, quote unquote. So I think that's a great example and something to keep in mind, how interwoven is that a word? Interwoven these different concepts are, and how by addressing, for example, water infrastructure in developing countries, we can even address gender equality. Very, very interesting, and definitely highlights the importance of investments in this area. And Jessica will come in a bit later and tell us a little bit more about this kind of equity side as well. So but if we go back to the UN Water Conference, right, now that we've outlined all these challenges and opportunities that exist in this area, if we look again at the outcomes of the conference, what do you think the results were, and what do we expect to happen now that the conference has concluded?
And we do expect a lot of regulations coming in the aftermath, and both the regulations on the sector, so we have the PFAS issue, so you need more purification of water, and you have antibiotics in water, and that is raising awareness, and you have the shortages and the floodings. And we also have these disclosure regulations coming forward. So all the companies present, they will need to report on how they consume water, how they recycle water, and if they are exposed to areas of high water stress and so forth. And even if that not forces companies to invest in a wise way regarding to water, it will reveal how each and every company do handle these issues. So it will be very clear what companies walking the talk. And again, that will make it easier for us investing our pension money to select what companies we would like to invest in that treats these questions.
One last question before I let you go. I can imagine that there might be some people listening to us right now who maybe work in the banking sector and they've never thought about water as something that they should think about, but now they're curious. And you have worked with this topic for over a year, you said. Is there any advice you can give them just on where they can start or how they can begin thinking around this topic and their work?
I think if anybody who is interested in to read up on water should look closer to on what OECD is writing about the challenges, and also Stockholm Water Institute has been working with this issue a long time and was present also in New York, of course, and they arrange every year this Stockholm Water Week. So they are also a great source of information and further references for reading.
Yeah, definitely. And I will take the opportunity even to promote the SEB's research publication, The Green Bond, which can be found on our website, where the latest issue, the one that was issued in March, was dedicated to the topic of water. So there are actually contributions from SEBI in there as well as many other very interesting external contributors. So can definitely suggest checking it out as well. But thank you so much, Åsa. This has been extremely valuable. Thank you for taking your time to come and talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And now I'm very excited to welcome to the studio Jessica Mattsson, who's an analyst in climate and sustainable finance at SEB. And many of our listeners will hopefully recognize her from some of the previous episodes. So, Jessica, welcome back. I think you're the first guest to come back for the third time to the podcast. So, welcome.
Thank you. Wow, what an honor.
So, Jessica, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about this research project that you have been working on, looking into equities related to water. So, yeah, I will just let you explain what it is.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I'm working in the same team as Åsa and you, and I've also been hearing more and more about these the water challenges that we're facing, and also about the large investments needs in new solutions to the challenges that we're having. So the research project, which I've done together with my colleague Anne Kestner, started with us sort of trying to look into how, as an equity investors, you can be part of investing in these solutions to water-related challenges. And the main reason for this, besides wanting to make a good impact as an equity investors, is also that since we're seeing this larger focus on water, we're also expecting that there's certain companies that will profit from it if they are providing the solutions that we need to these challenges. So we sort of saw it as a possibility to a great equity investments as well. And I mean, personally, I wouldn't been able to mention that many, listed equity companies that are actually providing water-related solutions before this project started. So the goal was really to try to identify these companies that are providing water-related solutions, and then to put them together in an investment strategy, which would be, purely thematic, focusing on water, but also that could be considered as a sustainable investment.
Interesting. So how did you go about doing this?
We actually focused on two themes within the water space, because as you and Åsa already discussed, water is a really broad topic. So we were focusing on water infrastructure and water technologies. With water infrastructure, being companies that are building out new infrastructure, providing clean water and sanitations to more people. And water technologies being companies that are involved in, for example, filtration, getting water clean, desalination, and all of these different technologies. This was trying to, identify the companies that would actually profit from this larger focus on the water issue. And with these two themes in mind, we took a purely quantitative approach, so trying to create a screening process to find these companies. And we basically had two criteria. So first of all, the company needed to have a substantial part of their revenues that were actually involved in these kind of water-related solutions. And secondly, we also had some sustainability criteria. So, for example, you couldn't have a very large ESG risk. You couldn't be involved in controversial themes such as fossil fuels or weapons, etc. And with these two criteria, we managed to screen out a basket of 19 companies that were all focusing on water and contributing to solving these challenges.
So basket is like a portfolio, I assume,
Exactly.
where you've been analyzing these companies. And what was the geographical distribution between the companies?
It's actually quite similar to a world index. We were trying to make it that way. So we have, as a normal world index, quite a large focus on U.S. American companies, with around 65% of companies in that area. And the rest of the companies are in Europe. And this, I should say, is not because there aren't any other countries that are focusing on these types of, or any companies in those countries that are focusing on these areas, but because we were having a universe of only European and American companies.
So what period of time did you use to look and analyze these companies in the basket?
We mainly analyzed it during the last 5 years time. And like I said, we were only using sustainability criteria to screen out the companies. But when we were putting them into a portfolio of companies and weighting them to get the highest contribution to the theme as possible, which I forgot to mention, but was around 70% actually of the combined revenues that were purely engaged in the water theme. When we constructed that basket and sort of back tested it to see how it would have looked like if we started it in 2018, we were actually seeing that the companies had also performed really well financially. So comparing to a broader world index, they were actually outperforming during these 5 last years.
Okay, but that's very interesting. Did I hear that correctly, that these companies that, fulfilled these sustainability criteria and were also focusing largely on water infrastructure and water technologies, that they outperformed their peers? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, exactly. So when comparing them to a broad world benchmark during the last 5 years, they've actually reached quite a really high overperformance over that benchmark. And that, of course, is a back test, and we know that past performance is not a guarantee of future performance, but we thought that was super interesting since we were not at all optimizing on returns, but solely focusing on water solutions and sustainability criteria.
I guess as with everything when it comes to finance, there needs to be this duality, right, of financial return and positive impact when it comes to sustainable finance specifically. So that's just another example of how that can work. Very interesting. Thank you so much, Jessica. And of course, you have written a little piece on this together with Anne as well that people can find in the Green Bond report that I mentioned a little earlier. So there are a few more details in there, I guess. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about this project? Maybe something that you've learned that was surprising to you?
I would say the performance of the companies was, of course, unexpected, but also that I learned a lot of different new types of technologies and new companies that are actually working and are sort of vital to solve this issue. And being able to, or knowing that they're actually out there and investable for a private investor, I thought was really interesting.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for coming and sharing your insights. And super cool project. Thank you. And thank you so much to all of our listeners, as always, for tuning in to the podcast and yet another episode. Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, to make sure that you don't miss any of the future episodes. And if you have any questions or suggestions for topics you'd like for us to cover in the future, please feel free to reach out to us at nextgenfin@seb.se. That's all together without any dots, nextgenfin@seb.se. But for now, take care and goodbye.